Hey guys, 4 more sections to go. You're almost done with Math 121. Hasn't been easy, has it? 150 will even be more challenging. I hope all of you have signed up for fall. Make sure you've done that if you haven't already, because usually when we get back, we come back a week before students, all the classes are full. So you want to make sure you don't wait and then you don't have any classes to pick from. So get that done, and I'll be sending out an email probably on Monday just talking about the final chapter 8. So chapter 8 is not going to have a test because we're only doing half of it, but everything we do this week in chapter 8, 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, 8.4 will be on the final exam. So you want to make sure you still do the homework and all that, even though there's not a test, because there's probably 6 questions approximately on the final. And I'll tell you more in the email how to get ready for the final and all that stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to work with functions and compositions in here. So we're starting with algebra functions, which is, I think it's more like arithmetic of functions. It's adding functions, subtracting functions, multiplying functions, and dividing functions. So that's the algebra of functions, is doing the 4 different operations on them. So the domain of the new function will be the intersection of the domains of the original functions, which means we have to combine those and see what they have in common. So this is the notation they usually give, but or sometimes this, and I immediately write it like this, because then it makes sense. I go, oh, I take function f and I'm going to add it to function g. So to me, that makes sense. Same way with the subtraction. I take function f and I subtract it by function g. That dot, you can write it as 2 separate. This way, it's just f of x divided by g of x. And remember, the denominator can never be 0. So let's practice on some of these. So this is a nice little example just to give you an idea of the 4 different operations. So like I said, the first thing I do when I see this is I rewrite it like this, because that makes sense to me. Pull down function f of x, put a plus sign, and then pull down function g of x, and they both have to be in parentheses because they're 2 separate. You're adding this function to that function, and then you simply follow the rules for addition. Add like terms. X squared doesn't have anything to go with it. 5x plus 1x is 6x. 4 plus 1 is 5. So that's called adding or finding the sum of 2 functions. Now this one's a little bit trickier. A lot of you miss this on the chapter 4 test, so pay close attention. So this is f of x minus g of x. Remember, they both have to be in parentheses. Here's one function subtracted by a second function. But do you remember what we learned in chapter 4? Anytime you have subtraction, you have to distribute that negative. So what we did when we were doing it in classes, we would write it underneath. So that would be negative 1x and negative 1. That way it's all lined up and ready. We just put it underneath its like term. So x squared stays x squared. 5x minus 1x is 4x. And 4 minus 1 is 3. And several of you missed that on the test because you didn't distribute. You just subtracted the first one and forgot about everything else in parentheses. Don't do that. That extra 10 seconds will make the difference of getting it right or not, especially now that you're on our final's just going to be one shot, and it's either right or wrong. So you want to make sure you do everything you can not to make silly errors. So if it means taking an extra 10 seconds to write this so you don't forget to distribute, then do it. And then here we have f of x times g of x. So you put them both in parentheses. There's f of x times, and there's g of x. This one I didn't show the work for, so let's go ahead and show the work on the side. So you remember with this one, we have to take the smaller one and distribute it to everything in there. So x squared times x gave us x cubed. X times 5x gave us plus 5x squared. X times 4 is plus 4x. And then we learned you have to take the second element in the small parenthesis and multiply it by everything in the large parenthesis. So that would be plus 1x squared. And I am going to put the 1 there. And remember how we learned in chapter 4 to line up the like terms? And then 1 times 5x would be plus 5x. Put it underneath its like term. And then 1 times 4 is plus 4. If there's nothing to line it up underneath, then just leave it. And so then we get x cubed plus 6x squared plus 9x plus 4. And that is what we wrote over there. I just didn't show the work on it because it was taking so much room, but I thought, oh, it would be good practice anyway to go through it with the students because we haven't seen it really since chapter 4. Okay, in division, you don't have to have parentheses because they're not beside each other, but the only way to simplify in division is by factoring. So factors of 4 that add to 5 are 4 and 1, all positive signs. So x plus 4, x plus 1, and x plus 1 in the denominator. So we cancel those like we learned to do in chapter 6. So my answer is x plus 4. But remember how we said, but x cannot equal, we can't let x equal anything that'll make this denominator undefined. So x cannot equal -1. So both of those will be required on Connect. So you want to make sure you understand both. So x plus 4 is what's left. Then we have to say, as long as x does not equal -1. Remember when we had the restriction box in chapter 6? Well, it's back. So whatever makes this 0 has to be thrown out. So the only thing that will make this denominator 0 is x being -1. So we have to say x can't be -1. Okay, should we practice on some on our own? So this is asking me for f of x plus g of x. So I'm going to write it in my own writing. And this is asking us for f of x minus g of x. And this is asking us for f of x times g of x. So I put it in my familiar notation because that's not really familiar to me. This says take the function f and add it to the function g. And then f of x divided by g of x. So that way they're all ready to go. So now let's do it. And remember, parentheses are required. So f of x would be x squared plus 2x minus 15. Then you put the plus sign in. Ooh. And g of x is x minus 7. And remember, that's really 1x, so you can put your little 1 there to help you. I don't know, that's looking kind of blurry to me. I don't know why it's not. Okay, that's cleaned up. So then we have x squared. It doesn't have anything to add to it, so it stays x squared. 2x plus 1x is 3x. -15, -7, -22. So there is the sum of the two functions, f of x plus g of x. I wish I could say this section stays that easy, but it's not quite that easy, but at least it starts off nice and easy. So this one, we're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to have a minus sign there. So x squared plus 2x minus 15, and then minus 1x minus 7. So we wrote the first function, added, wrote the second, did the same thing this time with a minus. But remember, this has to be distributed. So tucked underneath, I would write negative 1x here and positive 7 here, so that when I'm adding them, I'll have the like terms all lined up and ready right there. So negative times a positive, negative, negative times a negative, positive. So that leaves me with x squared, because it has nothing to go with it. 2 minus 1 is positive 1x, which is just x. Negative 15 plus 7 is negative 8. Nice, huh? And next, it's a little bit harder. It's f of x times g of x, so we're going to have to do all this. So f of x is x squared plus 2x minus 15, and don't forget your parentheses, times g of x, which is x minus 7. So we have to do the exact same thing we did up here. So distribute the first times each and then the second item in the little parenthesis. And when we had a lot of room and we did this, I told you to switch it around, but as long as you can go backwards, you're fine. So first we're going to take the first item in the small parenthesis and distribute it to everything. And these, it's really about being neat and orderly when you go to do them, because they're easy to do, but you just have to be very orderly. So this will be x to the third, because we add exponents, plus 2x squared minus 15x. So that's the first round. Then we have to take the second round and do the same thing, which would be negative 7. So not just 7, negative 7 times x squared times x times negative 15. So negative 7 times x squared would be negative 7x squared. And then it would be negative 7 times 2x would be negative 14x. Negative 7 times negative 15. Is that like 135? So negative 7 times negative 15, 105. And it's positive because it's a negative times a negative. So positive 105 out here at the end. So the product of the two functions is x cubed. 2 minus 7 would be negative 5x squared. Negative 15 and negative 14, negative 29x plus 105. So that would be our product. And last we have the quotient. So this is f of x, which is x squared plus 2x minus 15. This is the only time you don't have to use parentheses, because parentheses are assumed when you have division. And so factors of 15 that differ by 2 are 5 and 3, and the larger one has to be plus. So this would be x plus 5, x minus 3, and you can see we get the negative 15, and 5x minus 3x is 2x. On this one, nothing cancels, so that just means it's our answer, but then we have to write x cannot equal, what would make this 0? 7, right? 7 minus 7. So we have to circle that whole thing as our answer. So what you get after factoring, and then nothing canceled, so that just means that's our answer, but then we have to name the restricted value, x cannot equal 7. Okay, so we'll come back on the next video and start page 2.